very happy to have you with us virtually. For those who were not able to join us and who follow us via the webinar. Precisely for those who are with us online, you are all muted. Okay, so I see me in my back, great. You are all muted, but you can ask your questions via the chat, and we will try to address them after the speeches. This is actually the first time that we can organize a physical event in our office here in Paris, Marily and I, for the Paris Arbitration Week. As you know, the last two editions are to be held virtually. And for the occasion, we wanted to offer you a very nice event with very nice speakers. And I hope that we have succeeded. Our topic today is the role of climate change in post-M&A arbitration. Well, climate change is definitely one of the greatest challenges that we face in our time. Since the beginning of the century, we have observed that legal disputes concerning climate change are snowballing. With roots in the US, the evolution has rapidly spread around the globe and now comprises of more than 2,000 cases filed in about 40 countries. And simultaneously, the pressure on companies and on board members to align with the Paris Agreement is growing significantly, to the extent that actually it's becoming a legal obligation rather than a voluntary practice. And this was recently highlighted in the Milieu Defensive versus Royal Dutch Shell case in May 2021, in which a Dutch district court, unless mistaken, that was the district court of The Hague, which ordered Royal Dutch Shell to reduce its CO2 emissions by 45% compared to 2019 by 2030. And in March this year, Client Earth, an environmental law charity, announced it is taking action against Shell's board of directors to establish their individual liability for failing to properly prepare the company for net zero carbon emissions. Along similar lines, and we will talk about it a bit further today, the European Commission published its proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence aimed at imposing on companies due diligence obligation covering the adverse human rights and environmental impacts of their own operations and those of their subsidiaries and their... Thank you. You're all welcome. So their own operation and those of their subsidiaries and their upstream and downstream value chain. And once companies commit to reducing emissions and to sustainability standards, they then face regulatory scrutiny of the accuracy of their statements and the risk of misleading customers and shareholders. And in that context, regulatory authorities and shareholders are bringing claims regarding disclosure and mitigation of climate-related risk or the veracity of climate change and sustainability commitments. And with this in mind, investors are increasingly shifting climate change consideration from the margins to the core when choosing between and negotiating investment possibilities in different sectors. The increased impact of cooperation on social and environmental well-being drives home the weighty consequences, obligations, and liability risk associated with such corporate decisions. Accordingly, different issues related to climate change can arise in the context of M&A before, during, and after the contractual phase, which can lead to a range of disputes to be settled through arbitration. And this year, Paris Arbitration Week calendar highlights the international arbitration community's continuing interest in the topic of climate change. You will have seen that in several events, speakers will address climate change from various angles, and our session, the current session, contributes to this discussion, focusing on climate change in post-M&A arbitration. To talk about this topic, as I said, we have eminent panelists. We are lucky today. And first, Annette Magnusson. And I should have my notes which are not in the right order. That's wonderful. Here we go. That was not improvisation. So after having been Secretary General of the Arbitration Institute of the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce for 10 years, Annette co-founded in 2021 Climate Change Council, a think and do tank with a mission to mobilize the law and lawyers for climate action. This leads Annette to work with clients primarily in matters relating to systematic change through research and trainings, and to be engaged in high-level dialogues with management to foster change. Annette is definitely a must-have for our seminar today. Patrick Baeten joined ENGIE in 1996 and has held several senior positions at regional and corporate levels, including General Counsel Europe and General Counsel Brazil. He now serves as ENGIE's Chief Legal Officer for M&A and Investment. Patrick lectured European energy law at the University of Leuven in Belgium, and he's now a member of the Scientific Committee of the CEPANI, the Belgian Center for Arbitration, of the ICC Institute of World Business Law, and of several ICC task force, as well as a regular speaker at conferences, in particular on climate change and litigation. Patrick is also definitely a must-have for our seminar today. Eliseo Castineira is a partner with Castineira Law. He has participated in numerous international arbitration proceedings as counsel and arbitrator. Eliseo is inter alia a member of the ICC Commission on Arbitration and ADR, and a member of the French Association for Arbitration's Board of Directors and Arbitration Committee. He's also an expert in international arbitration for the Council of Europe, advising various governments on arbitration law, practice, and reform. Moreover, and you will see that it is interesting for our topic today, prior to his arbitration career, Eliseo was an M&A lawyer with Anderson Legal and Freshfield Brookhouse Derringer. And in addition to his numerous legal skills, Eliseo devotes significant time to acquiring and developing scientific and engineering knowledge on energy and climate change. You have understood Eliseo is a must-have for our seminar today. And finally, my partner, I'm lucky, Marily. Marily is in charge of the international arbitration practice here at Fieldfisher Paris. Marily is also a member of the ICC International Court of Arbitration for Greece and a member of the ICC Commission on Arbitration and ADR and of several other institutions. Marily is, of course, the fourth and last essential part of our event today. Before starting our discussions, I would like to disclaim something that I've already disclaimed actually during my discussions before the session. I am not a climate change specialist, as opposed to our eminent panelists here. So, Annette, could you please explain to me, what does climate change actually mean? What have been the latest developments? And even though it's clear that climate change is a crucial issue affecting all of us as humans, why is it also especially relevant for lawyers?
Thank you very much. I'll be happy to do my best. And thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Fieldfisher, for inviting us here today to discuss with you this very, very important topic. And I am very pleased, not least in this less than a year since we founded Climate Change Council, but to see how climate change issues have sort of become so prominent in the discussions also in the international arbitration community. That's very good news, and I'm very happy to see this happening, and of course also very happy to be part of it. So as you heard, my task here today is to sort of start out the bigger picture, to kick us off with sort of a general description of where we are when it comes to climate change and latest developments. So that's sort of a daunting task. There's a lot to be said, and I'm inclined to say, well, I'm not a climate change specialist either, right? So there could be a lot of specialists, and not least scientific specialists out there. But what I will do, I will paint the bigger picture, and hopefully I will drill down from there to and land at sort of the topic for today, M&A disputes and climate change. And then I will hand over nicely to my colleagues here, the experts on the panel, who will take you through different perspectives on that particular topic. But of course, a lot can be said when it comes to climate change and where we are today. We could talk about policy, we could talk about science, and not least we could talk about legal developments. And just simply reading the news on a daily basis gives us some element of what is happening in climate change. I thought I'll set the scene for the discussion today by just referring to the most recent Ipcc report that was published last month on 24th of February. And for those of you who think this is sort of overwhelming to read the entire Ipcc report, I can recommend the summary for policymakers, which is really a good read to get an understanding of where we are in the world today. This report is derived from more than 35,000 scientific studies that has been processed by the Ipcc, so there's a lot of knowledge that has been poured into this report. And I think the report in the summary includes a number of observations that could be of particular relevance also when we're talking about how lawyers across all practice areas are likely to meet the consequences of climate change if they have not already done so in the daily practice. So these are some of the findings in the report that I think could be noteworthy if we want to understand where we are today in climate change, where we're putting our lawyer glasses on, so to speak, and how we are likely to meet this. So we know that the rise in weather and climate extremes has already led to some irreversible impacts as natural and human systems are pushed beyond their ability to adapt. Irreversible, I think, is the key here. Key infrastructure systems, including sanitation, water, health, transport, communications, and energy, will be increasingly vulnerable if design standards do not account for changing climate conditions. Again, I think many lawyers do get in contact with key infrastructure systems in one way or the other. Near-term actions that limit global warming to close to 1.5 degrees would substantially reduce projected losses and damages related to climate change in human systems and ecosystems compared to higher warming levels, but cannot eliminate them all. Actions cannot eliminate all consequences of climate change. We need to adapt. Climate change risks to cities, settlements, and key infrastructure will rise rapidly in the mid and long term with further global warming, especially in places already exposed to high temperatures, exposed to along coastlines and with high vulnerabilities. Again, these are things that are already happening. An important element are the costs. Costs for maintenance and reconstruction of urban infrastructure, including building, transportation, and energy, will increase with global warming levels, higher costs for all corporations and public bodies. Weather and climate extremes are causing economic and societal impacts across national borders, across national boundaries through supply chains, markets, and natural resource flows, with increased transboundary risks projected across water, energy, and food sectors. Again, these are contexts where you would see many lawyers being involved. If we focus slightly more on some of the solutions, the Ipcc report notes that many adaptation options exist and are used to help manage project climate change impacts, but their implementation depends on the capacity and the effectiveness of governance and decision-making processes. This, we all have seen, can be a great challenge. Energy generation diversification, including with renewable energy resources and generation that can be decentralized depending on context, can reduce vulnerabilities to climate change, especially in rural populations. So this is some of the adaptation we have seen. And finally, the overwhelming majority of global tracked climate finance was targeted to mitigation, while a small proportion was targeted to adaptation. Probably we need to see more of adaptation measures. And again, I think this would involve a lot of involvement from lawyers. So these are just some examples, and there you have it. The effects of climate change are here, and we need to include it in any scenario we make for the future, irrespective of the practice that we are involved in. And failure to do so would come with consequences. They could be practical, they could be legal, or they could be both. Now, the realities in the Ipcc report are, of course, already visible to the people on the planet in various degrees. Perhaps the physical consequences is what we think of first, when we see the effects of extreme weather events and the consequences it has for people. But also in the practice of international disputes, climate change has sailed to the top of the agenda. And you have heard examples of this from the introduction here, including, of course, here, we have seen also a lot of events here at the Paris Arbitration Week. And again, it's good that we're having this conversation. I think climate change related disputes has become and this might come as a surprise that I say this, but I think it has become as a welcome daily reality for a number of organizations. Of course, some would say it is not such a welcome daily reality, depending on which perspective you apply. If you are the NGO, if you are the government, if you are the private sector, or if you are the lawyer in private practice or what have you. But there is certain strength in the fact that we are now bringing climate change also into the dispute resolution practice. Now, when we say climate change related disputes, what exactly do we mean by this? This could be a number of different things, and we should be aware of the fact that climate change walks through the door, so to speak, of an international dispute in many shapes and forms. Many of climate change related disputes have climate change at the core of the dispute. So these would be disputes, litigation cases, for example, where you would see reasoning around the Paris Agreement or human rights and climate change or the SDGs. But a large number of climate related disputes, and perhaps this is where we see most, we will see more cases going forward, are so-called, you could call them indirectly involving climate change. So this will be a transaction, this will be an M&A project, this will be an infrastructure project where the effects of the project or the outcome of the transaction actually will have some sort of effect on, for example, greenhouse gas emissions in the future. And this is probably the category of cases where we'll see most international arbitration practitioners become involved. You have heard the numbers when it comes to climate change litigation, so many, and it is now close to 2,000 cases. What is interesting with this number is the fact that this development is sort of exponential. So more than 1,000 of these cases have been brought in the last 6 years. So we see a sharp increase of the number of litigation cases. Previously, most of these cases were brought by citizens or civil society organizations against governments, for example, for failure to act accordingly under their international commitments. But there is a small but increasing portion of these cases that are now being brought against corporates, private corporations, and their perceived role in the climate crisis. And it is expected that these cases will be on the rise. And you've heard two of them now being mentioned, the Shell case from last year and the Client Earth case that was just filed recently. One question, of course, that could be asked, is there any connection between climate litigation and international arbitration? And I think there could be some interesting connections, because as cases against private parties in climate litigation appears to develop and increase, the arguments and strategies in these cases also is developing. One observation has been that there is more diversity in the arguments now being used against corporations, including, for example, cases involving greenwashing or what is actually the boundaries or of the fiduciary duties in the private practice. So, for example, this would mean that litigants challenge the insufficient, inappropriate communication by the corporation relating to climate change. They challenge corporate inaction in the past or insufficient ambitions for the future in the corporate. And again, putting it under the umbrella of the fiduciary duties. And I do think that as legal standards are being developed or evolving, bearing climate change risk at mind, it is not unlikely that we will also see these standards or these evolving standards also being reflected in the practice of international arbitration in the context where these standards have a bearing on the matters of the case. That could be in cases involving assessment of financial risks, again, fiduciary duties and corporate due diligence, and issues related to greenwashing, just to mention a few. So if we drill down further then and arrive at sort of the M&A disputes and climate change, there are some elements, I believe, in M&A transactions that have interesting bearings on climate risks, and I am sure we will hear more of that from my co-panelists in just a second. And these are risks that could be likely to appear before an arbitrator near you soon, unless they have already done so. So if you look, for example, at the due diligence process, for example, questions that could be asked include, what is this corporation's understanding of risk from a climate change related perspective? And when we talk about climate risk, that involves the physical risk, regulatory risk, risk for disputes, the market risks, investment risk, the entire risk portfolio, but put your climate change glasses on as you are assessing these risks. I just learned the other day that flooding is apparently the most costly natural disaster in the world. That was a bit surprising to me. So, you know, how vulnerable is this corporation to flooding? Where are the plants situated? Where are the warehouses situated? What kind of infrastructure do you rely on to transport the goods in this corporation? Another question that could be asked is, what are the climate risks associated with any recent significant transaction? For example, as you see, as you review them from the board minutes as part of the transaction. Has there been any review of the carbon or climate impact of this transaction? And how much has been spent on climate change in the past 10 years in this corporation? These are some of the questions that could be at the focus if you are looking at climate change related issues and M&A disputes in an arbitration. And I think I will end there and hand it over to my colleagues, but I'm sure we'll go into some of more of the details on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annette. So, who better than ENGIE's Chief Legal Officer for M&A investment to address the influence of climate change in M&A transaction? So, Patrick, do we see the influence of climate change on strategy, pre-development, and the investment decision process? We already heard part of the answer. And in addition to what Annette already said, do we see an evolution in the due diligence process due to climate change? What about the contractual documentation? And finally, what about the post-closing disputes and post-M&A arbitration? Patrick.
Lots of questions. Thank you, Maxime. Thank you, Marily, for having me here today. It's a pleasure. Thanks to all of you to bear with me for, well, probably 10 minutes in between two fancy Paris Arbitration Week cocktails. Well, yes, I mean, as an M&A lawyer, especially probably with ENGIE, I wake up with climate change, I work with climate change, and I go sleeping with climate change, I'm afraid. For various reasons. Obviously, the first reason is that, as some of you might know, I mean, ENGIE is fully, when I say fully, is full to 100% engaged in energy transition. We have very ambitious goals in terms of net zero by 2045, which for utility is as I said, quite ambitious. And all of this has been embedded in the statutes, in the articles of incorporation, because some of you may know, since 2020 we have the raison d'être, a purpose, apart obviously from making our shareholders happy, which is to, and I quote, to accelerate transition towards carbon neutral economy, to reduce energy consumption and more environmentally friendly solutions. So obviously, what does that mean? That does mean that in every single decision ENGIE takes, we're asking ourselves the question whether, for instance, in M&A, what we're targeting is really in line with those overall ambition in terms of net zero carbon. And it has very practical consequences. And I may refer to what's actually going on in Russia and Ukraine. France is depending for 20% of its gas sourcing on Russian gas. So you will have heard some politicians and other people say, well, we should obviously switch to another source of gas. Well, that is great, except that if you switch to other gas sources, that will necessarily mean that you switch to LNG, which has, in terms of CO2 emissions, 9% more emissions than pipe gas. And if you say LNG, the source is probably in the United States or in Canada, which means shale gas. Exploration and production of shale gas is forbidden in France because of CO2 emissions, because of environmental impact. So it's just an example to show that we're constantly balancing between competing goals, competing targets, and in every single transaction we're considering, it's a question we ask ourselves. We've been looking into hydrogen, we've been looking into biogas, we've been looking in so-called renewable natural gas, for instance, from landfills, emissions, etc. We've been divesting coal generation units since a couple of years in Indonesia and India and Brazil recently. We have the ambition to be at zero coal by 2027 globally, which is a kind of an issue, of course, because if you shut down the plants, but then you have issues with local populations, local workforce, etc., because they're pretty much, at least in some countries, pretty much depending on coal to have electricity at all. So you can't close the plant. But then if you want to sell it, you need to find a buyer, and the buyer needs financing, which is obviously not really easy anymore these days. All of this to come to translate, obviously, when we go to the really investment decision-taking process, all of this translates in pretty stringent documentation. To give you an example, I mean, within ENGIE, we have kind of two gates before actually investing. We have a development committee and then an investment committee. At the development committee level, the advance notice, we call it, that we have to file to the committee, there's a section on the strategic fit. And part of this section is dedicated to sustainable development investment criteria. And there's a matrix, and you have to fill it in. And same at the investment committee level and board decision level. We have the so-called CSR map with at least two criteria which directly relate to climate change, which is a CO2 equivalent emissions and energy efficiency. So the very choice of M&A targets is already impacted by climate change considerations, and obviously rightly so. Same, it was already mentioned for due diligence. The French lawyers among you know that there's in France a loi relative au droit de vigilance, which has now been, it's in the process of being somehow duplicated at European level. I think it's Annette who mentioned it. We have this proposal for directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, which has been very explicit Article 15 on combating climate change, which says that member states shall ensure that in case climate change is or should have been identified as a principal risk or a principal impact on the company's operations, the company includes emission reduction objectives in its plan. So this is something we will need to check when we do a due diligence on a potential target. And this is something which will be checked if we're selling affiliates or assets or whatever potential buyers. They will check if we did what we have to do. And by the way, it's not a strictly European perspective. The Securities and Exchange Commission has published a couple of days ago, on the 21st of March, a proposed rule on climate risk disclosure. So it's all around. And then obviously in due diligence was already mentioned, you have the classical issues on potential litigation or pre-litigation, permitting, maybe up-and-coming climate change-related regulations, and that can go pretty far. I mean, it can go up to state aid, feed-in tariff. We all know about the Spanish case, right? So all of this is pretty prevalent in everything we do, even for partnerships. I mean, if ENGIE is considering entering into a partnership, for instance, with a fund to do something, for instance, in Brazil, we will look into the other investment of this fund, not only based on the devoir de vigilance, because we have to, but also because we don't want to be associated with, for instance, a fund which would invest heavily in coal, because this is not compatible with what we stand for. Going to deal documentation, well, I mean, it's the logical consequence. You did the due diligence, and obviously what you found in the due diligence will somehow translate in reps and warranties, might translate in specific liabilities and indemnities on both sides, by the way, seller and buyer. And of course, we all know we're in a highly volatile environment. I mean, biologically speaking, and regulation-wise. So the importance of force majeure clauses, change of law clauses, material adverse change clauses, etc. All of this will increase dramatically. One similar example. I mean, we've been considering at one point in time investing in hydropower assets in Brazil. Now, you may know that in Brazil we've been facing for the last couple of years a huge drought, but this has an impact. I mean, it's due to climate change. It has an impact on the value of those assets, and it can change almost overnight. So it has an impact not only on the pricing, but also on the pricing mechanism. We've been reflecting on earnouts and deferred payments, etc., depending on the rain. So it's everywhere, and you can see, by the way, I mean, applies to Google. You say climate change and M&A, you will see a huge number of sites dedicated to the question, including one which is called the Chancery Lane Project, which proposes typical templates, including on M&A. I've listed a few of them here. There's a clause on disclosure of climate change plans in SPA investment agreements. There's a clause on green shareholders agreements. There's a clause on climate purchase agreement and underwriting sponsored warranties, etc., etc. So climate change is there. It is having a immediate impact on M&A transactions. It has an impact on the documentation of those transactions. And at one point in time, luckily not yet for ENGIE, but I think it's going to come. I mean, it will have an impact on post-M&A disputes, of course. Some of you will have read the Ipcc report of last year, saying that investments in projects designed to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions is a rapidly growing area. The area is set, and I quote, to expand exponentially as a result of systems transition, and this is very likely to give rise to climate change disputes, and may be appropriate, we'll get to that, may be appropriate for arbitration. There's of course no reason that should be different for any different for M&A transactions. And maybe to end, and that might be a transition to my fellow panelists. I mean, I think just to give one very concrete example, there's something that has been pointed at by the Ipcc report and saying, well, arbitration for climate change related disputes has probably all the necessary features to be very efficient. That being said, it might require at one point in time more transparency, because obviously there's an increasing pressure for disclosure of information. It's public, has public policy implications, etc., etc. If arbitration is going to be more transparent, and if arbitration, and that's the next step, is going to accept more easily additional parties and the score year, etc., this might have an impact at one point in time on the choices that companies make to choose either for arbitration, which is the preferred way to go, or to go to the judiciary. you will know, I mean, discretion and privacy is one of the key features for companies, especially a bit cynical, but especially when it comes to sensitive issues. So we'll see what it gives, but what is for sure is that we're in a rapidly changing world, and we need not only to mitigate, but we need to adapt.
Thank you very much, Patrick. This event to be a discussion between the panelists. So do we already have reaction on what Patrick said? Eliseo, I saw you had you took many notes, so you were in the starting block.
No, it's agree.
Yes. Maybe if I could just give a few points on what I've heard so far, starting with you, Maxime, if you don't mind, after your overly generous presentation of all of us, at least overly generous for me. On the comments you made, you referred to, because I think it gives a good background for the people, you referred, Maxime, to the action that had been initiated last week by against the board of directors of Shell because it was not doing enough supposedly to mitigate its climate footprint and to reach net zero. The very interesting feature about this lawsuit is that Client Earth is not suing the board of directors as an NGO or a charity. They're suing as a shareholder. They bought shares in Shell so they can attend the shareholder meetings, and they're saying, hey, as a shareholder, what you are doing, or exactly what you are not doing as members of the board of Shell is going to have an impact on the value of the shares. And I'm a shareholder, so it's there's this interesting dynamic because we always tend to think of NGOs, suing companies and governments, but people are buying shares as well, and that could be NGOs or anyone else. So it's an interesting phenomenon, I find. The second point on Annette's presentation that I found obviously excellent, when she referred to the Ipcc reports, just to encourage you, I think she showed the executive summary for policy decision makers. It's, I think, 32 pages long, so you can read it. It's the full report is 4,000 pages, so I don't think that many people read it, but this is 32 pages. If you're interested to go beyond that, there are other summaries of the full report, and there's a scientific summary that's about 100 pages long also, so that's very digestible, I think, for people. One comment, and I'll try and be quick, but in the last installment of the Ipcc that came out in February, I think for the first time, the Ipcc uses the word degrowth. I think it's never been used before. Last year, the European Environment Agency issued a report called Growth Without Economic Growth, basically saying that decoupling was very, very difficult to achieve, i.e. economic growth without the consequences relating to the increases of CO2. So you start seeing political bodies and scientific bodies that are not taking the same position on the same issues and are contradicting themselves. Last point I want to make on Patrick's presentation, maybe for information purposes about the purchases of LNG and Shell oil. When you see what happens in Europe, all of a sudden you're saying, oh, we're gonna import gas from somewhere else, not from Russia. That implies having regasification plants. We have 20 of them in Europe. Germany all of a sudden realizes that it must build on an expedited basis 2 of those plants. So it's a lot of work actually to regasify the gas. And also when it comes from shale oil, we must not forget that shale oil or shale gas is bottom of the drawer fossil fuel. It's low quality, low efficiency, and it's very hard to operate. And a lot of companies in the US that actually exploit shale gas actually go bankrupt. So even if we want to, it's not necessarily if we don't care about climate change. Even in that case, relying on shale gas, which generates a lot of bankruptcies in the US because it's very hard to exploit, is a very difficult endeavor. Sorry to have taken so much time, but I just wanted to make those comments about what I heard before.
Many thanks, Eliseo. Annette, any reaction at this stage?
I would suffice to say that I think what we have heard from Patrick and also from the comments here, I think it really illustrates the complex world we are living in, and there is no sort of easy black and white solutions, and the LNG example I think illustrates that, because from a geopolitical stance you will have one clear black or white, and from a carbon emissions you will have potentially another, and then you could add third elements to that. And I think when we talk about how we navigate the realities of climate change, if it's from a corporate perspective or from a policy perspective, I think we all need to get used to the fact that it's all different shades of gray. There is nothing black or white, and we will have to feel a bit uncomfortable with the choices we make, regardless of, I mean, we have to decide what is the polar star we're navigating by, what do we think is more important, and then take the potential cost or consequences to that. That might sound a bit glum or a bit depressing, but I think it's just where we are, because we need to adapt in different levels, and the world is just so interconnected and so complex that the choices we'll make, there will not be choices that will be all comfortable and nice and shiny, because they will have their potential challenges unique for them, be that from a climate perspective or geopolitical, and that's something we just have to learn to live with. Sorry for sounding a bit depressing.
I can add to the depressing part.
I can too if you wish.
No, but I mean, it has nothing to do with M&A. I mean, people read newspapers, right? So you might have seen what's going on in Belgium. We've been deciding, the Belgian government has been deciding in 2003 to get out of nuclear, and now because I'm Belgian. We just decided not to get out of nuclear so fast, kind of so fast after 20 years, but nevertheless. But to make that possible and to get back to nuclear, also because of the Ukraine crisis and the benefits of gas, etc., I mean, we need to build new gas-fired power stations in Belgium. So we need gas to make sure that we can extend the lifetime of the nuclear power plants to diminish CO2 emissions. So you see, I mean, it's like, I mean, and I agree with you on it. I mean, it's not black and white. It's never black and white. And you hear people telling you, well, it's black or white, they're lying, or they're stupid. Whatever.
I wanted to ask you privately, Patrick, but I'm doing this privately. I think ENGIE was involved in the nuclear power plants in Belgium, right?
No, of course it's power plants.
So you're being asked to restart investments at the moment?
Yes. We've been kindly asked, requested.
And you've replied positively, or
no, we didn't reply yet. What we said consistently since 2018 or 19 is that if we want this to happen and to happen in a safe way, which is obviously what everybody wants, is that we needed to know by the end of 2020. So we're late.
Sort of.
So there will be discussions. There will be discussions. And we'll see whether ENGIE can and whether ENGIE is prepared and under which conditions, and whether that matches the conditions that have been set or will be set by the Belgian government. But I'll refrain for obvious reasons.
Thank you very much. So let's now focus on arbitration. At the end of the day, this is the arbitration week. So let's ask the question. And is arbitration the right means for having climate change related disputes settled? Does arbitration provide the right tools to resolve post-M&A disputes involve climate change issues? Marily, can you help us?
Thank you, Maxime. Yes, despite the I would dare say, rather bleak landscape, we're all arbitration practitioners, most of us in this room. And so we are wondering and we are quite questioning how all of this fits in our practice, whether arbitration remains the right forum for the resolution of climate change disputes. We more or less know the answer for post-M&A disputes because we've had probably one way or the other to deal with, let's say, more classic post-M&A disputes. Combining the two in one and the same case, in one and the same dispute, might give rise to a few more difficulties. Patrick mentioned the limitations that arbitration has been, is being considered to have. So we'll go over just a brief, a brief overview as to why indeed arbitration is well placed for climate change and post-M&A disputes. And of course, there are, Annette mentioned, there are different types of disputes. There can be the disputes that are linked to the implementation of projects that had to deal with, have to do with climate change, new business opportunities, new commercial contracts, potentially new disputes. And then the more indirect potential disputes that may arise out of more straightforward transactions and M&A transactions, but with the climate change element and development happening. It can be disputes relating to warranties and representations, for example, that give rise to additional difficulties. So I think that there are these two broad categories of disputes. Now, the Ipcc report on climate change that was published a couple of years ago very usefully highlighted a few areas where we can see an increase in climate change disputes, adjustments to emission regulations, renewable investments, as I said, carbon trading and pricing, and environmental warranties and representations. Now, these are more general related climate change potential disputes. Now, in M&A transactions, what can we envisage? And I'm saying what can we envisage? I think up to very recently, we're probably doing a lot of ball gazing, anticipating what the future will bring. With climate change happening now, these disputes are coming into light as we speak. So M&A transactions can give rise to disputes with a climate change element out of supply chain agreements, when, for example, deliverables do not meet the required emission levels. Obviously, renewable energy projects and disputes can vary from performance to valuation. More straightforward joint venture contracts can give rise to disputes, joint venture disputes with provoked and caused by climate change elements. And of course, implementation of new technologies that fail to perform at the expected levels, for example, could give rise to claims for misrepresentation, negligence, breach. Now, the question I wanted to examine is whether indeed arbitration provides the right tools for resolving this type of disputes. And again, the Ipcc report, of course, the answer is easy, it's yes. Why? Because expertise required, both technical, but also both specific to the M&A sector, which is quite a niche, an industry-centric, gives rise to industry-centric issues, I think. Arbitration also allows an efficient resolution of urgent disputes. As we all know, most arbitration groups provide for emergency arbitrator procedures. When it comes to climate change related disputes and environmental impact, it may be necessary, to prevent reversible consequences through emergency arbitration proceedings. Of course, ensuring the implementation of climate change commitments through, of course, a suitable agreement by the parties in the contract. This is also possible. And of course, the report highlights many useful examples, sample wording, sample clauses, very innovative ideas, not just case management techniques, but for example, the potential use of dispute boards, for example, in the resolution of climate change related disputes. It's an innovative idea. I think that it gives rise to a lot of, lots of food for thought to adapt, as Annette said, to think outside the box and try to see what the tools that we have been using in a specific way can help us do to deal with climate change disputes. Now, arbitration is also suitable for resolving M&A disputes, and I mentioned that there are the more traditional M&A disputes that we may be more familiar with. One of the defining feature of post-M&A disputes is obviously the multi-party aspect of it. Parties in M&A disputes can involve a combination of different sellers, insurers, guarantors. There can be various SPAs agreements or insurance contracts, ancillary contracts. A whole multitude and variety of agreements in one and the same transaction can give rise to different players and different, parties in the same dispute. And as you probably know, the ICC statistics show that the multi-party disputes account for a large proportion, 1/3 almost, of the ICC's caseload. And tools like joinder of third parties, consolidation of more than one arbitration proceedings are very useful in dealing efficiently with the needs arising out of disputes in a post-M&A context. But Patrick gave us a little flavor of the limitations that arbitration and the way arbitration is being used may give rise to. Issues like confidentiality, transparency are becoming a lot more hot, a lot more important. Confidentiality has always been seen as one of the main advantages of arbitration. Private parties choose arbitration because of the privacy it offers and the confidentiality. But when climate change issues are at stake, public interest issues are at stake, what is the role that confidentiality can play? Should we be getting rid of a certain amount of confidentiality? Should arbitration be called to play a role? Parties in arbitration proceedings, arbitration practitioners, arbitral institutions, do they have a role to play in this? It's an interesting, I think, question that the community has been reflecting upon. Obviously, the idea of the publication of arbitral awards has been debated for some time. This, I think, could be, depends on how it's implemented, of course, could be a good way going forward, providing parties, the community, with an insight on how climate change issues are dealt with by tribunals and how public interest is taken or not into account, and actually contribute to the accountability of parties involved in this type of dispute. So the opaque nature of arbitration that has been a benefit and is a benefit may see its limits, I think, as climate change disputes will be arising. And with we chose to approach this climate change through post-M&A disputes because with the increasing number of transactions on all sorts of different levels, there is bound to be an interaction between M&A transactions and climate change, and we should be ready to address issues like confidentiality and transparency. Patrick mentioned the idea of amicus curiae, a concept that we see in investment arbitration, and that it's almost unheard of in commercial disputes. Now, it's interesting that most arbitration rules do not prohibit the use of amicus curiae in commercial disputes. But of course, unless there is a public interest involved, why would one consider that it's necessary to have amicus curiae in a commercial private arbitration? This is another example of what we should be more thinking about. And this is where, again, either arbitral institutions or arbitrators themselves, I think, should be thinking about the discretion and the power that they have to order, when necessary, the submission of amicus curiae or address some flexibility, introduce, some flexibility to confidentiality. So there are ways, and we have seen with the ICC's proposal to, well, not just proposal, it has started since 2019. The publication of awards is offered to parties. There can be reductions. There can be all sorts of different solutions, like even publishing only parts of arbitral awards that do relate to climate change issues, not the whole award. I think it's necessary to contribute for arbitration to be as useful as it has been so far, to recognize the role that it has to play in these disputes coming forward and be in a position to adapt. Now, I mentioned the arbitrator's power, so looking forward to hearing what Eliseo has to say about how, to the extent that arbitrators should or are able to play a role in this.
Thank you, Marily. So now that we know that arbitration is appropriate to have post-M&A disputes involving climate change issues, thank you, Marily. Let's now focus on the arbitrator's perspective on three particular questions. First, what is the role of arbitrators in M&A disputes involving climate change? Second, what's the impact of climate change consideration in rendering awards in post-M&A disputes? And finally, what is the arbitrator's powers with respect to climate change considerations? Eliseo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maxime. I'll rebound immediately on what Marily has just said regarding amicus curiae. She mentioned that nothing prevented arbitrators in most institutional rules from hearing amicus curiae submissions, but that it's very, very rarely done in international commercial arbitration. But obviously, if you look at the ICC rules, for instance, Article 25.2 says that the arbitral tribunal may decide to hear witnesses, experts appointed by the parties, or any other person in the presence of the parties. That any other person, obviously, as Marily implied, does encompass amicus curiae. And obviously, M&A arbitration is not the same as investment arbitration, because in investment arbitration, you've got a directly evident public interest at stake that is not necessarily apparent in an M&A transaction when you have two interests, that are usually private interests, between the seller and the purchaser of the company. So public policy always plays a more indirect role than in investment arbitration, for instance. That being said, I think we need to keep in mind what the role of the arbitrator is in general, and what the parties expect and don't expect from an arbitrator in an M&A dispute, even involving climate change. What the parties expect, as we all know, is that they have an opportunity to participate in the constitution of the arbitral tribunal, and that the arbitral tribunal has the requisite expertise and dedicates the appropriate time to render a detailed award. And I think after respecting due process, obviously, and I think what is very important to parties also is that they want the award to be detailed enough so that each losing party on a particular point understands why it's lost on that point. And that's, I think, a very important expectation of the parties. But the parties do not expect that arbitrators lecture them about how they should have structured their transaction to make it more climate friendly. They just expect arbitrators to decide on the claims between the seller and the warrantor sometimes and the purchaser, and nothing else. Nothing more, nothing less. So this is really the role of the arbitrator that we have to keep in mind. That being said, we also know that justice plays a role, to the extent that an arbitrator's task is not just to render an award that's valid at the place of arbitration, and that does not contain flaws that would not make it enforceable at the most likely places of enforcement. I think the basic duty of the arbitrator is to get it right, because it's even worse to render an award that is perfectly valid at the place of arbitration, but you get it absolutely wrong on the merits. So the arbitrators should tell to get it right. And on climate issues, that means literally understanding the background behind the climate issues. Also regarding public policy, arbitrators in the private transaction, as I said before, they're not the guardians or the custodians of the public policy, the public order, but they should try their best not to ignore public policy and public order, because the analysis of public policy consequences cannot be deferred simply to the stage of enforcement of the award. If there's a public policy issue, like the climate public policy issue, it needs to be tackled in the proceedings in the arbitral tribunal, before the arbitral tribunal. And I think in order to get it right on what the arbitrator should decide an M&A dispute involving climate change considerations, you have to be aware, obviously, of the regulatory and judicial environment that was described before. There's a law in France, there's a law in Germany about the duties of care of management for climate change issues and human rights issues. There's the Commission's proposed directive that will come into effect in 2 or 3 years regarding corporate sustainability and global change that involves climate change. Obviously, that will be taken into account, as Patrick said, in the structure of the M&A transactions. There's all of those state court decisions, sentencing states like the Netherlands, Poland, France, or corporations because they were not doing enough to mitigate the effects of climate change. There's this SEC proposal that Patrick mentioned that I believe is very interesting because it basically says that if you're a company listed in the US or you have subsidiaries that may fall under the application of US law, because they're a part of the group is listed in the United States as a public company, if you published a plan saying that you're going to be carbon neutral by 2030, 2050, then you have to explain how you deal with scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. So that's a very tricky situation because scope 1 is the direct emissions of the company, how it operates its business. Scope 2 is basically the electricity that you need to purchase or the heating you need to purchase to run your business. And scope 3, which is the real problem and which represents 90% of the emissions, is upstream and downstream, the emissions of your clients and your suppliers. And that's a very tricky one. So arbitrators, just like parties, should be aware of all of that regulatory environment when they decide claims that may arise in relation to those compliance issues on a case. Because in concrete terms, if you're subjective to this proposed SEC rule, I don't know if it's going to be adopted. I don't know how many proposed rules of the SEC don't make it into law, but let's assume it's going to be adopted. You're going to have claims in an M&A transaction when the seller sells a company saying, well, here is what the target company did with regard to scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. And the purchaser is buying the company and realizes, well, on scope 3, you were not complete because you forget this part of your emissions at the level of that particular supplier in that particular country. So there will be disputes on this probably. There will be disputes on third-party claims, like a company making advertisements as to the fact that its products are carbon neutral. There's a lawsuit against the company, and after the company sold, the purchaser says, oh, the company is now being sued because it advertised wrongly and there was greenwashing in the way it advertised its products. So here's my claim as a purchaser against the seller because the company made wrongful advertisements. So arbitrators and counsel will need to be aware of this regulatory and judicial context. Then there's the powers of the arbitrators. I mean, the very broad powers, as we know. They can investigate the facts very deeply, as provided for instance, in Article 25 of the rules of the ICC. and that's obviously a very important factor. There's 2 points on which I want to focus, because we have tremendous powers as arbitrators to investigate matters, and we should get it right, as I said before. So on climate change, that means 2 things in my view. There's essentially, there are other things, but I think those are really dominant points. There's what expertise is to be required from arbitrators, and how do we view experts in an M&A transaction with respect to climate change considerations. With respect to arbitrators, and I think it's a very important point that was made by Marily and also by Patrick, you know, with all of those transparency movements, and you know, a lot of people choose arbitration because it's confidential, or at least they think it's confidential. Sometimes they have surprises later on, but either way, at the end of the day, a lot of your words will end up in the public domain, and also with setting aside actions or challenges to the enforcement of awards, and there will be leaks. So we should make sure as arbitrators that none of the language used in the award contradicts science. I think it's very important. I don't want my awards as an arbitrator to contain greenwashing language. So we need to acquire the basic scientific knowledge. I'll give you 2 examples of things that you shouldn't see in an award, in my view. There's no carbon neutrality for a product. I'm happy to discuss that later on, but if you have an award that says, you know, the company sold this product that was carbon neutral, and the arbitral tribunal finds that indeed this product was carbon neutral, the award is wrong compared to the science. I'm happy to discuss it at length later on. Also, there's a lot of tricky language that may find its way in the awards. And the example I have is clean energy, green energy. And the truth is that unless you want to go back to the early 18th century, before the Industrial Revolution, and to go back also to the societies as they were back then, with the size of the population of the early 18th century, so you know, 150 million to 200 million people, and the type of economy we had back then, unless you want to do that, whatever energy we're developing as, whatever energetic system we're developing as advantages and inconvenience, but it is not clean. And I'm happy to discuss this later in the Q&A. So even if some regulations refer to green economy or clean energy, I think we have to make sure what that means in terms of the science in the awards, because at the end of the day, the laws of physics are intangible, and the laws, economic rules, accounting rules, legal rules, they're social conventions. And asking that physics adapt to accounting, economics, legal rules is not going to happen. It's by definition not possible. So really, it's very important. How do we get that training? It's very easy today. For instance, if you're French, l'École des Mines, which is a top engineering school in France, makes available for free its online course on climate change and energy. So if you know the rule of 3, and even I know the rule of 3, then you learn a lot about chemistry, physics, geology, topography, climatology, and you have the basics, 30 hours. And I think everybody should get that type of training to understand the underlying issues, and at least get the words right in the awards. Now, and this is going to be my last point regarding experts. As we know, the tradition usually is that we go the common law way, and we have experts appointed by the parties, and arbitrators are rather reluctant to appoint their own experts. I think if issue is, and that may well arise in an M&A transaction, if issue is whether there's a reps warranty that says that emissions trading certificates are emitted in a certain way, and they help the company reaching net zero if one of the claims disputed is this, or if you want to measure whether the company that was sold actually emitted more or less CO2 that was specified in the contract, or if the claim is whether you were compliant as a seller with your scope 1, 2, and 3 obligations. Here, we're not talking about measuring euros, but of measuring emissions. And there's a very strong public interest in that respect, because this information, if we get it wrong, will make it into the financial statements. And it will also affect shareholders who buy the shares. And it also affects the third parties like insurers that insure the company. So it's not just the interest of the private parties, the seller and the purchaser. And when you're measuring not euros, but basically emissions that play a role in some of the refs and the warranties of the M&A contract, the SPA, I think my thinking at this stage is that we should give it a try to having experts appointed by the arbitral tribunal for various reasons. I think it's very delicate, especially if the arbitrators are not well trained in the concepts, to have a party-appointed expert that says, oh, there was 0 emissions, and the other party-appointed expert that says, you know, it's 1 million, and the arbitrators are very uncomfortable finding their way. And I think, frankly, on CO2 emissions, getting it right is going to matter more in general terms than getting it right in terms of euros. And I think some of the experts that have the best training to do that, with the best available science, as the Ipcc uses that term, are simply experts that are not necessarily well-versed into the techniques of arbitration, in particular the adversarial nature of the proceedings, and they're not very comfortable with aggressive cross-examination from counsel or from hot topic. And also one advantage, I think, for those issues of having an expert appointed by the arbitral tribunal is that basically, because the parties and the arbitrator have to participate in the definition of the mission of the expert, I think it forces the parties and the arbitral tribunal to focus very early on in the case on the climate change aspects of the transaction if they're relevant. If one of the issues at stake in the M&A transaction is, you know, did the seller ensure that the company that was sold complied with its scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which is a claim in the arbitration, and you want to get it right on the emissions. If you think of an expert appointed by the arbitrator, you know you have to define this issue. So you focus early on the issues. I think it's a very good way to do it. And at the end of the day, you must not forget that when the expert is appointed by the arbitral tribunal, the parties have a say in the way the expert is appointed. They have a say in the definition of the mission of the expert. They can comment on the draft expert report before it's finalized. They can ask questions to the expert, and they can also ask that the expert be summoned to the hearing to be examined. So it's not like the parties are losing control of the whole process. But I think really we should give it a thought in that respect. I've been a bit too long, I think.
That's perfect. Thank you very much, Eliseo. That's my job to, well, to keep it to keep the debates on track. Reactions of our panel. I saw you, Patrick, reacting, especially on the green energy part. Maybe.
Yes, well, I mean, I have full sympathy for Eliseo's point of view. I mean, the only clean energy is the energy you don't consume. I mean, that's basic. It comes back to the black person point. But for me, as a person, not speaking for ENGIE, but as a person, I mean, the only way to be as efficient as possible in terms of combating and adapting to climate change is consume less. That's the very basic. Because what you don't consume, obviously, doesn't affect the footprint you have. So that is one. Another point of interest, I think what was mainly mentioned is the publication of awards. I must say I'm a bit uncomfortable with publication of awards. Luckily, you can insert in your contract a provision saying, well, that the award will not be published. do at this time. I have
Someone that disagrees.
yeah. Well, I'm sure a lot of people will disagree.
His board is online and is reacting apparently.
I'm sure they're in line. The problem I see with publication of reports is, I mean, we're not discussing just treaty arbitration. This is about private interest, and by definition, I agree, private interests have an impact on the community, of course. But I mean, this is the world we're living in. It's kind of private justice, and I think if arbitration wants to keep a bit of a long shot, but if arbitration wants to keep its competitive edge in terms of dispute resolution, I think institutions and others should be very, very careful in designing their rules, etc. If you push it too far, at one point in time, parties or some parties might say, well, you know, this is actually not what we're looking for. And we will turn to other proceedings. That can be talk arbitration, other rules of arbitration. It can be mediation, it can be whatever. So I think this is something that arbitration practitioners should be aware of. Last point of reaction in terms of how about experts appointed by the arbitral tribunal? Well, from the arbitrator's perspective, the answer is obviously yes. This is something, especially in those kinds of questions, this is something we should not decide, at least consider. But again, I mean, as a party, whether claimant or defendant, that's perfect for me under one condition, and that it does not impact negatively in terms of cost and time. And that's a tricky one. Now, that being said, I know what you're going to answer. I mean, what counts is the ultimate result. It's getting it right. So I agree. But you know, from a party's perspective, getting it right after 5 years is maybe not exactly what we want. Maybe we then would prefer to have, and I hate states, so, but maybe we'd rather have an average award after 1 year than a brilliant award after 5 years. Maybe.
That's why you need arbitrators that are very well versed in the subject and they understand. I'm myself very reluctant as an arbitrator to have. I have never appointed an expert when sitting in an arbitral tribunal because I always thought, you know, if the arbitral tribunal is not able to look at the two expert reports from the parties, and then possibly they can confirm what they agree, what they disagree, and if the arbitral tribunal is not good enough to do that, to examine the evidence of party-appointed experts, then how the arbitral tribunal is basically worthless. That was always my thinking, and I've never appointed an expert myself as an arbitrator. But in this restrictive area where we count, and there's maybe not going to affect that many transactions, where what's behind the claim is how much CO2 really we emitted. I think at this stage, counting CO2 right is more important than counting the euros right. So I think we should give it have an open mind in that respect. Then also, I think it also very much depends on the kind of arbitrators you get and how well they understand the issues. If the arbitrators are not familiar with the issues, I think we really should give it a thought about that type of expert. And it doesn't.
And then maybe the parties did not do the right choice.
That's why we should appoint it.
Yeah, right.
Thank you, Eliseo. Annette.
So it's not black and white and it's not green, so it's getting complicated. But anyway, on the issue of transparency, I think so. This is the way I look at it. It's so if we look at all the commercial arbitrations taking place in the world, or that has taken place up until now, and if you just imagine the wealth of experience that this represents and contained in the awards, right? Something, and in essence, to be honest, most of them represent something that went wrong because obviously from a corporate perspective, you do not want to do arbitration, you don't want to do disputes, you want to do new deals. So something went wrong, and what went wrong, that's what you learn from reading the awards. So that's the way I look at all these, the knowledge contained in all of these cases. And at the same point in time, we are in a point in history where we are we need to act very, very fast. We need to reduce emissions by 50% to 2030, and we need to reach net zero by 2050. And we need to have all these large infrastructure projects happening now. And we know that the big investment decisions being taken now, the investment cycles to reach those targets, they have already begun. We are in the middle of them. So we have to be aware of the fact that we have to act urgently, and we have to act fast. So why not use that experience that is represented in this wealth represented by all of these cases? I'm not saying that is easy, but what if we could have other competitors even help them avoid making the same mistake for the sake of the planet? I mean, it's just as simple as that. So I think arbitral institutions have a very good position to step forward and to design maybe a model clause for transparency in climate-related disputes. So I throw it out there to any arbitral institution that wants to pick up that idea and develop something. So forward-looking corporations, they could include that in their arbitration clauses. And I appreciate the fact that you do not want to give your crown jewels to your competitor, right? You want to keep that close. So, but find a way to share what is relevant so others can avoid making the same mistake as you did, or your partner did, or the policymakers did, and to speed up the transition, because we know we need to speed up the transition. And there's a lot of ambition out there when it comes to climate change, and institutions, they have a very good position to take those ambitions, embed them in the rules or in the clauses, and make them into obligations. And we know that's when things will actually start happening. And what if you as a corporation could say that this is part of your public image? We are a forward-looking corporation. We include the climate transparency clause in all our dispute resolution agreements, because we understand the importance of sharing the knowledge for the sake of for the greater good, if you want to call it that. And what comes to my mind is when the X-ray was developed by Röntgen. He did not apply for a patent on his invention because he understood the importance for humanity of what he had found with the X-ray. So what if we could do the same things when it comes to development of smart solutions to address climate change? I think that would be brilliant. And I think arbitral institutions, for example, and practitioners can be part of that. That's my take on confidentiality.
If I can just add a follow-up point on what Annette said, I think that you mentioned smart solutions, and I think there are smart solutions, and there may be more out there. Redacting commercially or sensitive parts of an award, publishing awards, a few years after it's been issued. Now that may not, help achieve the goal, which is sharing the knowledge and sharing the information, but there must be ways to strike the right balance between protecting private parties' interests and contributing to, to a more general good. So maybe we can discuss with Alexandre afterwards over lunch about how Eastmund is, implementing smart solutions.
And let's open the floor. So, is there any question?
Hello, my name is Sandro Cunha. I'm from Connecticut, a technical expert. I do a lot of construction-related disputes, and we have lots of claims for climate impacts on the construction. And the way we present, we look at the information, the data, the historical data to show that there was an unpredictable factor that caused that dispute or that impact. But with the climate change, we've been hearing for years that there is global transformation, the icing, the levels of the seas are increasing. We have hotter summers, we have more rainfalls, more floods, all that are being historical, building historical data. So how could that be a part of a claim in such case if there is a sort of the trend on the change and not something that is really unpredictable?
I can take that one. Let me make a parallel with what happened with COVID. I mean, what we've seen, obviously, when COVID started is a lot of force majeure. But what happened, including in ENGIE, smart guys started to redraw the force majeure clause, saying, well, and it became some sort of, COVID-19 conscious clause. Like, well, of course, there will be a force majeure clause in our new contracts, but we all know the pandemic is out there. So that is by definition not force majeure anymore, and that it was acceptable. That's a different question. My take is we're going to see this on climate change as well. Because obviously, again, I mean, if we want to buy hydropower assets in Brazil, well, we know there's a draw. So then, speaking to the sellers 2 years, 3 years, 5 years after the closing, say, well, I mean, your projections, what I've seen in the info memo and in the due diligence, etc., does not correspond in any way with the reality because there was no rainfall in the northern part of Brazil, which led to huge negative results for us. I mean, the guy was saying, well, I mean, climate change is out there, you know it. So they will have, and to avoid that discussion, I foresee that at one point in time you will have those kinds of climate change conscious clauses into documentation. Another funny subject for M&A lawyers and arbitration. But
hello, Gillian from Michael Lemaire. I just wanted to pick up on what was being said about smart solutions, and I know Patrick mentioned this. We are, of course, talking about arbitration today, but many conversations about arbitration are not complete with conversations about mediation. Certainly to my mind, for many cases, mediation is a smart solution. It covers the need for speed, which is very important here. Confidentiality, you can do what you want, and you can involve as many players as agree to be involved. So I wondered what the panel thought about mediation.
I can say I agree. No, I do think that the list of advantages of mediation is clearly quite long, I think, not least from a business perspective. But I think you could add to that list the time frame that we are working in, and that we need to get to the end of stalemate in a conflict sooner to get on with business. So I think the mere fact that we are on the countdown towards 2030 and 2050 adds another reason why one should opt for mediation, for example. Absolutely.
And from my perspective, again, I couldn't agree more. I mean, to me, it's the most efficient way to solve pre-litigation or litigation, the difficulty I'm facing in day-to-day life. I mean, just to give you one example, I mean, ENGIE is a huge group with a lot, very decentralized, with a lot of affiliates, etc. I mean, we have a standard dispute resolution policy for disputes between affiliates. I mean, it's pretty simple. I mean, there are a couple of sentences, and the first sentence they say, well, the privileged way is obviously mediation within the group. So I think the consciousness of the advantages is there. The difficulty I'm facing in day-to-day is more psychological work, because I mean, the basic difference from a corporate perspective between mediation and litigation is that mediation, you're still deciding. Litigation, you say, well, we can't decide, we can't agree, so let's ask to another one to decide in our place. And paradoxically, that hampers a little bit the use of mediation, because let's be politically correct. I mean, the higher up in the hierarchy you are, the smarter the people. And the smarter the people, the more they tend to think that if they didn't get to an agreement with the counterparty, why the heck would the mediator help them? And that's the reason why we don't do enough mediation for me. But it's more of a psychology than anything else. I mean, I fully agree. I mean, you could win enormous amounts of time and money if we privilege mediation over, even over arbitration. And I love arbitration. As long as ENGIE is not involved. For the sake of the record.
Another question on the chat. Have any of the panelists seen a post-deal pricing dispute due to climate change? For example, dispute over closing accounts or SPA clauses that impacts either pricing or post-deal price adjustment? And same question for warranty claims.
No, for me the answer is no. But it's not yet.
Not, yeah.
But today, no.
But it will happen in quite a
Yeah,
lot. Because at the end of the day, whether it's earn-out clauses, whether it's your financial statements in general that are nicely attached to the SPA, they'll be impacted by this scope 1, 2, and 3 analysis in every jurisdiction where there's going to be a compliance obligation in that respect. So you'll have, I think, quite a few of those claims.
And I think so. This is also true because of the reason mentioned by with targets coming up in a few years. This will add pressure and I think intention to this type of situations.
Any other question? So thank you very much to our panelists for those really interesting discussions. Thank you for being here or with us online. And for those who are with us, Marily and I invite you to the cocktail. I don't know really where it is. It's just, okay, it's just across. And for those who are online, I think it's now time to say goodbye. So thank you very much. But we are going to the cocktail. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Or first to Patrick, because I told him more than 2 reasons.